Welcome to the Book Faire Podcast. I'm Anthony, and this podcast is all about the freedom to read and children's literature. This week, an interview with Sasha Payton Smith, author of The Rose Bargain. PEN America releases the most banned picture books for 2024, and a look at Donald Trump's executive order that could pave the way for school choice and its consequences. First, we begin with an interview with Sasha Payton Smith, author of The Rose Bargain. Hello, Sasha. Good morning, and how are you doing today?
Good morning. I'm doing great. I woke up at 6 a.m. Utah time, and I'm not normally a morning person, so I'm jacked on so much coffee, but ready to go.
That's okay. I'm not a morning person either. Do you want to introduce yourself as well as the book that we're going to be discussing today?
Of course. So my name is Sasha Payton Smith. I'm a young adult historical fantasy author. I have written 3 books. The Witch Haven and the Witch Hunt were my debut series about a school for witches in 1911 New York. And my new book is The Rose Bargain, a new YA romantasy duology about an alternate history Victorian England where the Queen of England is a fairy and the high society debutantes must go make bargains with her to help them find husbands. Our main character, Ivy Benton, joins a vicious competition for the hand of England's fairy Prince Bram, but is soon drawn into an unexpected alliance with his human brother, Prince Emmett, who wants to take down the Queen and has some plans for Ivy with his own political machinations. I am originally a biologist and a public health practitioner, and then I wrote my first book in graduate school as a project just for me. And it's, spiraled into this wonderful teenage dream career, and I feel so lucky that I get to now do this for a living.
And you mentioned that it's an alternate history version of England. Besides the fairy and fae aspects, are there any other aspects that you chalk up to being historical fiction and a little less historical?
Yeah, so it's interesting. My first series, The Witch Haven, took place, there were witches, but it was ostensibly real 1911 New York. And so I was very rigorous with my historical research and making sure that every single thing that happened in the book was something that actually happened in 1911 and the places were real and as many people could be real as possible. This book was a different process for sure. So in this book, the fairy queen tricks her way onto the throne during the War of the Roses, during the English Civil War in the 1400s. And so up until 1471, English history is exactly the same. And then we have this fairy queen. And so I got to have a lot of fun in world building and what would be the same and what would be different. And of course, I relied on real Victorian England because I wanted to evoke a feeling, in these romances that deal heavily with manners and standards and, acceptability, I think is always a fun push and pull. But I got to research things like, what existed before 1471 that I can't change. And so I learned things like the Prince of Wales title predates 1471. So her son would still be the Prince of Wales. And things like Parliament has existed since the 1000s and the Magna Carta. And so Parliament still exists. I gave myself a little bit of wiggle room. Things like I still named Kensington Palace Kensington Palace. Would a fairy queen have named it Kensington Palace? Probably not. But I still wanted those real, historical touchstones. So I had a lot more fun getting to world build in this book than my first series.
Right. And you brought up what's acceptable and different social standards. And this kind of leads into one of the topics that I did want to talk about is with historical fiction and writing for young audiences, this concept of debuting in society is something that we don't really deal with in the 21st century. Can you talk a little bit on what that meant at the time and what people who are reading The Rose Bargain today may not know about debuting in society in a historical context?
Of course. So, in America, we have some debutante balls. My grandmother was actually on the board of a debutante ball. And so when I was 16, my mom was like, do you want to go to Alabama and come out? And I was like, no. But in this historical context, women had very little social and political power. All of their, social standing and economic standing came from their husbands. And so these young women, usually at 18 in British high society, went in front of the Queen and they'd curtsy in front of the Queen. And you were only allowed to do that if your mother had done it or if you had a sponsor who had done it, like a godmother or an aunt or a, particularly kind neighbor. And it announced that you were now open for business, that you were now merchandise on the marriage market. And so it was the most important moment of these women's lives. And the courtship process was the only brief period in which they had any power, because for a brief moment they had the power to choose whose proposal they accepted, but that was kind of it. And so in the Rose Bargain, these young high society girls are expected to bargain with the queen for a trait that will help win them a husband. So a prettier nose in exchange for your favorite childhood memory. And our main character, Ivy Benton, finds that really disappointing. She is upset that the one opportunity she gets to touch magic, she's expected to use it for the benefit of a man. And so it was a fun place to start world building from.
And you mentioned how the status, both financial and social, is tied to the husband. And I want to make sure that I word this very carefully, because I want to make sure I'm getting all these points out.
Yeah.
So Ivy is a strong and very dynamic character that kind of bucks against gender and societal norms.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel that at the surface, from an outside perspective, the perceived cliche, that is, of two men fighting over a woman is antithetical to her character?
No, I think that it's in line with her character, because she's given the power, and both of these men want something from her, be it a political upper hand or just her attention and affection. And for the first time, she's really being given the power in a relationship. And that's something too that's fun about the Rose Bargain, is there's no perfect way to be a woman, and there's certainly no perfect way to be a teenage girl. And there's a large cast of characters. Ivy is only one of 6 girls that are competing for Prince Bram's hand. And so within this cast of girls, I got to explore different facets of femininity and how people feel about growing up and marriage, and all of these girls have very different perspectives on Bram and the Marriage Mart and what they've been raised to do.
And with the aspects of how this story begins, we see how fragile and how contextual the societal standing is, how the value in society is very much up for judgment from other people, because something that is incredible, something that's out of the family's hands, which is Ivy's sister disappearing, is kind of the inciting incident that kind of tanks the family's reputation, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in this world where Ivy is essentially being raised as a product for marriage, her purity and her social inscrutability is the currency that she wields. And in Victorian England, I mean, before that, in history, your status was very much tied to your family. And so you're right, the book opens and her sister Lydia has disappeared and come back, and nobody knows where she was. And Lydia cannot offer a reasonable explanation. And so Ivy is disgraced. And, the little power she had has been taken away from her. And it was, it's interesting to write a society in which they're kind of devouring these girls alive. There's a line in the book where they're talking about Lydia, and it says the fun of grace is to watch somebody fall from it. And in this world where gossip is a sport, and you're kind of fed to the gossip mill, you're trying to keep your hands as clean as possible. And Ivy, through no fault of her own, ends up in the mud.
And you mentioned a word there that I think is very interesting, and I want to kind of probe a little bit, if you're okay with it.
Yeah.
You mentioned purity, and
Mm-hmm.
I see that you have you came up in Utah, attending university there.
Yep.
Would you like to just say anything about purity culture in general and how it may pertain to the Rose Bargain?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot I could say about purity culture, and we probably don't have time for it all. But yeah, I was raised in Sandy, Utah, in a very, conservative neighborhood and environment. And then I became a sex educator at Planned Parenthood. My work in public health before I became a writer was mostly around sex education and consent education. And I've seen firsthand the damage that purity culture can do to young people. And so I don't think it's a mistake that those themes end up finding their way into my work. And I also think that's why young adult literature is such a powerful tool, because it allows young people to explore topics of intimacy and vulnerability and falling in love within the safety and the bounds of fiction. And yeah, I think any stories that allow people to explore those topics also where these girls find empowerment in, owning themselves and their futures and their bodies, I'll always find important.
And yes, writing for young audiences is incredibly important. And I agree that on the aspect of purity culture, that's definitely one where having access to these kinds of books is incredibly important. And that's something that is unfortunately being challenged across the country right now.
Yeah. Yeah. It's scary and disheartening as an author and as a reader and as a citizen. I think that the right to read freely is one of society's most important, cornerstones, and keeping young people from books that touch on complicated topics doesn't protect them. And it's confusing to me when I see readers, there was a bit of a scandal on Book Talk post the election where people were saying, we can all disagree, and, reading is for everybody. And I agree that reading is for everybody, but reading is inherently political, and it's always been political. And it's true now more than ever.
Right. And especially with, as you said, your work with Planned Parenthood doing education, and just having access to these kinds of books that introduce these topics, and as you said, as a safe way, is protecting children. And that's a topic that's absolutely a topic that we can go on for ages, in my opinion.
For sure.
And this is something that I wanted to ask, because I did see this coming up. How do you feel about the label of romantasy, and how do you feel about that applying to the Rose Bargain?
So I actually like the Romantasy label. There's thousands and thousands of books that come out every year, and I think readers are always just looking for something that aligns with their particular taste. I like fantasy when it has a strong romance bent, when romance is one of the driving factors of the plot. So I don't mind it as, kind of a marketing label to help people more quickly identify things that they want to read, like any marketing title, particularly around work that is largely created by and consumed by women. I think that it's easy to malign it as something, less than or trendy. But personally, I like the title. I think that it's a quick way to identify a certain type of book that a lot of readers are seeking. And for the most part, I feel like I'm seeing it being used positively.
Really? I thought I was in the minority as someone who didn't care for the romantasy label. I felt it was limiting, but that's just my opinion. And I thought I was in the minority.
I might be in the minority. I might be in the minority, but I personally, as an author, I don't mind it.
And with reading the Rose Bargain, as much as I have read it so far, about 70 pages, I can say without hopefully offending you, I don't like fantasy. I've tried reading The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings a dozen times, and I can't do it. But the Rose Bargain is absurdly approachable for something that takes place in the 1800s. And is that something that's intentional in the way that the prose is written, to make sure that it's accessible for people who may not be used to ye old English type of fiction?
Absolutely. I have so much respect for fantasy authors that can do really, complicated, intricate world building. That is not my strength as an author. My main goal with The Rose Bargain was to write a popcorn book. I wanted to write the most fun book I could possibly come up with. I wrote The Rose Bargain at a kind of dark time in my life. And my goal for myself was to write something fun and consumable. And the ultimate compliment when people read The Rose Bargain is, I read this in a day. This took me 3 hours to read. Like, I could not put it down. And part of that is the accessibility of the world and the prose and the romance. And of course, that's its own kind of world building. But yeah, grounding readers in the semi-familiar world of Victorian England and then throwing in all of my favorite fantasy tropes was something that was done very intentionally.
And lastly, just to close off this interview, I like to ask this of all authors, so you can answer it however you wish. Sasha, how do you see yourself and the work that you do as a writer?
Oh gosh. I think a lot about the C.S. Lewis quote, we read to know we are not alone. I write for young people intentionally, and I think it's such a gift and an honor to write for young people. I hope that people feel reflected and seen in my work. I hope that it, provides some level of comfort in a world that is increasingly hostile to young people. I hope that I'm offering, both a reflection and an escape in these, kind of commercial fantasy novels that I'm writing.
Thank you. That was an interview with Sasha Payton Smith. Her new book, The Rose Bargain, is available now, and you can find out more about her work at sashapsmith.com. Now let's take a look at some recent releases in children's and young adult literature, beginning with All the Blues in the Sky by Renee Watson. Sage is left reeling after her best friend is killed in a hit-and-run accident, and since she was on her way to celebrate Sage's 13th birthday, Sage blames herself for the event. At school, she starts attending a grief counseling group where she meets Dee Dee and Ebony, whose loved ones also died unexpectedly. With the help of her new friends, her crush Kofi, and her beloved aunt Eni, Sage learns more about the grieving process. All the while, she struggles to move forward and grapples with regret over not having the chance to say goodbye. Alternating verse and prose depict Sage's present-day navigating new and uncomfortable experiences while going back and forth between her divorced parents' homes alongside memories with her best friend and the imagined future she wishes they had together. Quote, "We would be fantasizing about first kisses, first loves, dreaming about going to high school one day." These brief yet poignant vignettes drive home the immediacy of Sage's grief, as well as the importance of remaining attuned to one's emotions in this tender and heartbreaking interpretation of loss. This book is recommended for ages 10 to 14. Next is I.R.L. by Ginny Goebel. Upon first moving from San Francisco to small, rural White Pines, Alaska, due to her mother's occupation studying renewable energy, 6th grader Lucy Bell Rodriguez is excited to leave her former bullies behind. Yet she's disheartened when she's stuck at home doing remote learning from October to April, waiting out the treacherous Alaskan winter. Now that spring has sprung, though it's finally time for her first day of in-person schooling, Lucy is eager to get to know her classmates beyond her computer screen. But on her first I.R.L. day at White Pines Secondary School, Lucy arrives at a burned-down building with no one in sight. Convinced she has the wrong address, Lucy tries to find her school again and instead stumbles upon a graveyard with headstones bearing the names of her classmates. Is Lucy the victim of some elaborate prank, or are there supernatural forces at play? Lucy's palpable new kid anxieties and earnest search for friendship following past bullying and virtual schooling adds emotional depth. Immersive descriptions of the remote Alaskan landscapes inject eerie appeal to this sinister paranormal mystery. This book is recommended for ages 8 to 12. And the last release to look at this week is A World Worth Saving by Kyle Lukoff. A transgender teen and a golem aim to dismantle a supernaturally evil conversion therapy program in this satisfying, horror-tinged novel by Lukoff. After 14-year-old A. Eisenson comes out as trans, his Jewish parents force him to attend Save Our Sons and Daughters, a support group that's coercing participating members into backing a politician's crusade against gender-affirming healthcare. When agender Yarrow, A's closest friend in the group, stops attending meetings, ostensibly to undergo further treatment, A's attempts to uncover Yarrow's whereabouts leads him to discovering a golem made of trash that claims A must save the world from a growing evil. With the help of an understanding rabbi, A learns more about banishing Shadim, Jewish demons, that seems to be possessing the most ardent anti-trans folks he's encountered. But as A's search for Yarrow becomes entangled with his mystical calling, he realizes that the challenges are too great to face alone. This superb, fantastical adventure tackles serious, real-world problems faced by queer youth via unique interpretations of Jewish mysticism that, paired with A's powerfully raw emotional journey, further flesh out the thrilling plot. Most characters cue as white, and this book is recommended for ages 10 to 14. This concludes a highlight of recent releases. Now, looking at some headlines, but first, if you enjoy the work being done on the Book Faire Podcast, you can show your support by simply rating or reviewing the podcast wherever you are listening now. On YouTube, you can like, comment, and subscribe. You can also follow the podcast on Blue Sky at Book Faire Pod, or go to patreon.com/thebookfair. This is the best place to find resources that are shared on the podcast, as I will always post direct links to patreon.com. You can follow for free. No payment is required to access those resources. The best way to support the podcast is to simply share it with a friend, a relative, an educator, or a young reader in your life. Now, on with the show. Before we move on to headlines, a brief warning. There is no good news ahead. If following recent headlines has been detrimental to your mental health, you're welcome to skip the rest of the podcast because it is more of the same in regards to public schools, book bans, and education and libraries. However, if you do wish to stay, thank you very much. And let's begin with a report from PEN America that lists 23 of the most banned picture books of the 2023-2024 school year. PEN America counted over 10,000 instances of book challenges in the previous school year that targeted 4,000 unique titles. 2% of all book bans in public schools were picture books. Sitting at the top of the list is And Tango Makes Three by Peter Parnell, Justin Richardson, and Henry Cole. This book has been the subject of a year-long legal battle in Florida with Escambia County School Board. A recent update to the case came out in December, where a federal judge recommended the school board enter a settlement instead of continuing to courts. U.S. District Judge T. Kent Wetherell II wrote in a statement, quote, "A settlement should be particularly important to the school board because it is spending taxpayer money to defend this suit, and it could end up having to pay all or part of the plaintiff's attorney fees on top of its own attorney's fees if plaintiffs prevail in the case," end quote. Tango received 7 bans in public schools, making it the most banned picture book. The next 2 titles, with 5 bans each, were The Family Book by Todd Parr and Julian is a Mermaid by Jessica Love. The Family Book celebrates families of all kinds. Julian is a story of a young girl dressing up like a mermaid. Next up is When Aiden Became a Brother by Kyle Lukoff and Kailani Juanita, with 4 bans. The summary on PEN America says, quote, "When Aiden was born, everyone thought he was a girl, until he settled into life as a boy. So when his parents announce that they are going to have a baby, Aiden wants to make sure everything is right for his younger sibling," end quote. These titles show a clear pattern of targeting books with LGBTQ+ themes, or in the case of Julian is a Mermaid, even the slightest hint of gender identity. Next up is another scary story surrounding book bans. The U.S. Department of Education has announced it is rescinding all past guidance issued against the removal of books, and will no longer employ a coordinator to investigate instances of unlawful book bans. This is an example of the new administration quietly pulling away powers of governing federal bodies to protect the First Amendment and the freedom to read. This story is, of course, being undermined by rumors of an executive order to dismantle the Department of Education. This headline may very well be obsolete or moot by the time it's posted on Thursday morning. However, it is worth noting that this does set a scary precedent, considering the fact that an executive order cannot take away or establish a federal office. Finally, to finish out the podcast, a recent executive order from Donald Trump will allow states to reallocate funds for public schools through block grants to private institutions. Executive orders are making the news a lot recently, and it'll be helpful to just establish what an executive is and does. Executive orders are not laws. They are limited in power and temporary because they can be rescinded by the sitting president or a future president at any time. Conservatives in America have been pushing for school choice for over a decade. Voucher programs are only one way states are working to pull funding from public schools, and this is problematic. Private schools that receive funding from a school voucher program are funded through donations and tuition. Public schools rely on public funding. Programs like vouchers or this vaguely written executive order that allows states' education departments to allow funding or defunding of public schools will disproportionately affect families with lower income. Families that can afford to send a child to a private institution are then taking funding away from public schools when programs like this are implemented. It's throwing public money and funding into a privately run institution that is allowed to discriminate and deny enrollment where public schools are obligated to accept everyone. A private school can deny students with disabilities or low grades, meaning that public schools in the state will contend with less funding and higher needs of students. If you've listened this far, I do want to say briefly, I appreciate your support. Times are really scary right now. Public education is under the worst attack it's ever been in this nation's history. Every day there's a new headline and a new proposed rule or executive order or law implemented in House or Senate or in states, and it's hard to keep track of. The important thing is to remember to focus on your own safety and mental health. Being informed shouldn't come at the cost of your own mental safety. Thank you so much for listening. I'll talk at you next time.